September 1945. The war was over, but the air still carried the scent of burnt earth and sea salt. Beyond the barbed wire fences of a temporary U.S. POW camp outside Yokohama, thousands of Japanese soldiers sat in stunned silence. Their uniforms were faded to the color of dust. Their eyes, hollow, uncertain, followed the rumble of approaching trucks. From the open backs of those vehicles, American soldiers began unloading heavy wooden crates stamped in bright red letters. Coca-Cola Company. No one spoke. The metallic clatter of bottles echoed through the humid afternoon as caps hissed open and glass struck against glass. For men who had survived years of jungle hunger and the collapse of an empire, the sound was alien, a promise of something ordinary in a world turned upside down. One American sergeant smiled faintly as he handed a bottle through the fence. The prisoner hesitated, bowed slightly, then lifted it to his lips. The cold sweetness hit like a shock. In that quiet exchange, a bottle of soda between enemies, the first seeds of reconciliation were poured. The story of that moment begins not with sugar, but with surrender. In the final days of August 1945, Japan stood still. The war that had consumed the Pacific for nearly 4 years had come to an end with 2 blinding flashes over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Emperor's voice, quiet, distant, almost trembling, had broken through the radio static to announce the unthinkable: surrender. For millions of Japanese soldiers scattered across islands and camps, the moment was not triumph or defeat. It was silence. The empire they had sworn to protect no longer existed. The rising sun flag had been lowered, its crimson circle dulled by rain and ash. Across the Pacific, a very different world was stirring. On ships bound for Japan, American troops prepared not for combat, but for occupation. Crates of food, medical supplies, and construction materials filled the holds. Yet, among them, stacked beside ammunition boxes and field rations, were pallets of glass bottles and brass-colored bottle caps. They bore a familiar mark, Coca-Cola. For the U.S. Army, these were not luxuries. They were symbols, reminders of home, of routine, of everything that defined the American way of life. Throughout the war, Coca-Cola had followed the troops from North Africa to Normandy, from the Solomons to Saipan. Each soldier, it was said, deserved a Coke no matter where he was stationed. The company, supported by military logistics, built portable bottling plants behind advancing armies. By 1945, there were more than 60 of these plants operating under military supervision, producing millions of bottles a week. Engineers in khaki uniforms oversaw them like extensions of the front line. The drink was a taste of home carried into the chaos of war, a liquid morale weapon. Now, that same symbol was sailing toward the heart of the defeated empire. When the first American units landed near Yokohama in late August, they stepped onto a land stripped bare. Cities were skeletons of concrete. Rice harvests had failed. Food queues wound around the ruins. Even clean water was scarce. Civilians survived on barley husks, millet, and dried sweet potato. In some areas, families brewed ersatz tea from weeds and bark. The U.S. command understood that food, not weapons, would define the occupation's success. Feeding the population, restoring order, and earning trust became priorities equal to disarmament. The machinery that had once fueled total war now shifted toward humanitarian logistics. And within that network of relief came a strange, almost poetic element: comfort. Not just calories, but small moments of normalcy. Cigarettes, chocolate, canned fruit, and yes, Coca-Cola. The company coordinated with U.S. Army quartermaster depots to ensure that bottles reached the Pacific camps, along with medical kits and flour sacks. Some of the first Coca-Cola deliveries to Japan arrived aboard Liberty ships carrying Red Cross aid. The drink was intended for occupation troops, but word spread quickly through the ranks that they were to be shared cautiously, with prisoners and civilians as gestures of goodwill. In a land where the average person had not tasted sugar in years, a single sip of cold cola was almost surreal. To American soldiers, it was routine, the sound of home. To Japanese prisoners, it was incomprehensible, a drink that fizzed, sweetened, and refreshed, in a time when water itself was rationed. The symbolism went deeper than anyone could have planned. Coca-Cola had become a quiet ambassador, a message that America's strength was not only its weapons, but its way of life. That message was about to reach the camps. For most Japanese POWs, the days after surrender were a blur of confusion. They expected punishment, perhaps starvation. Instead, they were given food, blankets, and cigarettes. Rumors spread that Americans ate meat 3 times a day. Then, one afternoon, trucks arrived carrying the red-stamped crates. What followed in those camps was more than a drink. It was an introduction to a new kind of world power. Japan in September 1945 was a nation suspended between hunger and disbelief. The empire had collapsed, its armies scattered across Asia and the Pacific. More than 60 cities lay in ruins from incendiary raids. Railway lines were severed, ports destroyed, farmland flooded or poisoned. In Tokyo, the once bustling Ginza district was a field of twisted metal and broken tile. The smell of smoke still lingered months after the last bombs fell. The food system had disintegrated. Rations that once promised 1,800 calories per person had fallen to less than 1,000. Civilians lined up for hours for a handful of barley or a cup of watery miso. Teachers fainted in classrooms. Children learned to forage weeds along canal banks. In the countryside, families bartered heirlooms for potatoes. Black markets, called yami-ichi, became the only places where meat or sugar could be found, at impossible prices. For prisoners of war and demobilized soldiers, conditions were worse. Their military supply lines had vanished. The Imperial Army's vast stockpiles of rice and canned goods were seized or spoiled. Men returning from China and the Pacific arrived home skeletal, carrying malaria and dysentery. Then came the Americans. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, landed in Japan on August 30, 1945. His orders were strict: maintain order, prevent famine, and begin the reconstruction of a defeated nation without reigniting resistance. It was an unprecedented task, feeding a country of 80 million that had been the enemy only weeks before. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps moved quickly. Warehouses in Guam, Okinawa, and the Philippines were emptied. Liberty ships began shuttling flour, canned meat, condensed milk, and cooking oil toward Japanese ports. Red Cross convoys followed with medical supplies, and among those shipments, almost as an afterthought, were the products of American culture itself: cigarettes from Lucky Strike, chocolate bars from Hershey's, and bottles from the Coca-Cola Company. The idea seemed trivial compared to food aid. But to U.S. planners, these items carried psychological weight. Inside the temporary camps that dotted the Japanese mainland in the early months after surrender, silence was the language of survival. Prisoners were exhausted men, many of them officers from naval bases or soldiers captured in the Philippines and repatriated. They waited behind barbed wire, uncertain of their fate. Rumors drifted that the Americans were cruel, that executions would follow, that starvation awaited. Then came the unexpected. The guards were calm, even polite. They distributed food at regular hours: tins of meat, bread, and powdered milk, things the prisoners hadn't seen in years. At first, the men ate cautiously, expecting some hidden trick. But no punishment came. The Americans, it turned out, wanted order, not revenge. And then, one afternoon, crates arrived bearing an unfamiliar logo. The characters on the wooden sides were written in English, curved around a red disc. Inside were glass bottles, capped and sweating in the heat. The GIs placed them on tables, opened them with a sharp hiss, and handed them out, one by one. The Japanese soldiers stared. Some had seen the name Coca-Cola on captured rations during the war. Others had heard about it from propaganda leaflets describing American decadence. None had imagined it was real, or that it would be given freely by their conquerors. Those who dared to drink it later wrote of the experience with a strange reverence. One described the sensation as a festival in the mouth. Another said it was like tasting peace. The sweetness, the fizz, the coldness, all alien, all unforgettable. For a people who had been taught that surrender was shame, this small kindness carried disarming power. It didn't erase defeat, it humanized it. Coca-Cola had never been just a drink. Since the 1930s, it had been exported as an emblem of American life. Modern, clean, democratic, efficient. During the war, the company and the U.S. government intertwined their missions, morale through refreshment. When the soldiers fought, Coca-Cola followed. When they celebrated, it was in their hands. By 1945, that symbolism was deeply ingrained. To see a soldier drinking Coca-Cola was to see the embodiment of American identity. It represented leisure amid hardship, confidence amid chaos. For men who had marched through jungles and deserts, the sound of a bottle opening was the sound of civilization. To the Japanese, it was something entirely new. Their wartime culture had been defined by sacrifice, rationing, austerity, deprivation. Sugar had been reserved for the military elite. Sweet drinks were unknown luxuries. Even tea, the national comfort, had become bitter and scarce. So when the first prisoners lifted those bottles and tasted that sweetness, it wasn't just flavor they encountered. It was an idea, a vision of a world where comfort wasn't sin, where joy wasn't rationed, where abundance wasn't propaganda. American officers understood this, even if they never said it aloud. Food and drink were tools of diplomacy, and the occupation made full use of them. The United States Information Service later documented that the earliest civilian impressions of Americans often began with small moments of generosity. Candy for children, coffee for workers, and Coca-Cola for the curious. The brand soon became a quiet form of cultural exchange. Japanese civilians began to associate it not with invasion, but with relief. Soldiers who once viewed Americans as enemies began to see them as human beings, with habits and humor. People who laughed easily, who shared, and all of this began not with a speech, but with a bottle. Behind the scenes, this symbolic act depended on one of the most remarkable supply networks ever built. The American logistical machine, the same one that had delivered tanks to Normandy and fuel to Iwo Jima, now carried soft drinks to a shattered nation. Each bottle of Coca-Cola represented thousands of miles of coordination. Syrup from Atlanta shipped through San Francisco, bottled sugar from Hawaii, and glass recycled from Pacific Islands. Military engineers oversaw bottling plants near Yokohama and Sasebo. Japanese laborers, hired under supervision, cleaned, filled, and capped bottles that would go out to occupation forces, and occasionally to the POW camps. For American planners, this operation had a deeper purpose. Maintaining morale among troops stationed in hostile territory was critical, and Coca-Cola had proven its worth as a unifying ritual. The company even sent specially trained technicians known as Coca-Cola colonels, tasked with ensuring the supply chain stayed running no matter where the front moved. That efficiency didn't stop with the war's end. As Japan's reconstruction began, the same methods that once moved bullets and bombs now moved beverages and bread. The American military demonstrated a kind of economic power Japan had never seen, an industrial rhythm that could rebuild as easily as it destroyed. In this sense, Coca-Cola became more than refreshment. It was proof of logistical supremacy, that America could not only fight and win wars, but also deliver comfort to every corner of the world. And for the prisoners who received it, that supremacy was not terrifying. It was humbling. The same empire that had once dreamed of ruling Asia now sat quietly behind wire fences, holding bottles made by its conqueror, tasting not defeat, but an entirely new reality. The next angles would explore what that moment did to their minds, their sense of identity, and their view of the new world rising before them. For the Japanese prisoners, the war had ended not with battle, but with hunger and silence. The sudden shift from fighting to surrender, from authority to captivity, left many trapped in disbelief. They had been told that Americans were barbarians, that capture meant humiliation, that no honor existed beyond death. But the Americans who now stood before them offered not cruelty, but rations and care. And when the bottles of Coca-Cola appeared, sweating in the humid September air, something deeper happened. It wasn't merely refreshment. It was dissonance, a collapse of everything they had been told. Prisoners later recalled the sensation vividly: the coldness of the glass against sunburned hands, the hiss of pressure breaking the seal, the sweetness flooding the mouth. Foreign, overwhelming. It felt like tasting the modern world itself. In that moment, defeat acquired an unexpected dignity. The enemy had not crushed them. He had invited them into his abundance. The gesture blurred the lines between victor and vanquished. For some, it was humiliation disguised as kindness. For others, it was a revelation that power could be gentle. American officers, trained in psychological operations, understood this nuance instinctively. They knew that rebuilding Japan required more than disarmament. It required reshaping perception. Food, cigarettes, and soda were their silent diplomats. Where propaganda had failed, taste succeeded. A bottle of Coca-Cola became a tool of psychological reconstruction, a reminder that life, even after total defeat, could still contain sweetness. Throughout the Second World War, the U.S. military had learned that morale was as vital as ammunition. Soldiers who could smile, who could joke, who could hold a bottle of something familiar in their hands. Those soldiers fought longer, endured more, and bonded tighter. Coca-Cola had become a uniformed companion. It traveled in canteens, in supply crates, in the imaginations of men crossing oceans. Even in the jungles of Guadalcanal, troops built makeshift coolers from bomb casings to keep their sodas cold. Commanders saw the effect. Discipline rose. Desertion dropped. A bottle of Coke could boost an entire unit's spirit. By the time occupation began in Japan, in the years that followed, Coca-Cola's presence in Japan evolved from curiosity to cornerstone. What began as a morale drink for occupation troops became one of the first Western products produced on Japanese soil. By 1946, the U.S. Army had approved a small bottling operation in Tokyo under strict supervision. The factory employed hundreds of Japanese workers, many of them demobilized soldiers, to clean bottles, mix syrup, and load crates onto military trucks. For most, it was their first steady wage since the war's end. To American officials, it was economic policy wrapped in a familiar label. Each bottle sold to a U.S. soldier circulated yen back into the devastated local economy. Each worker trained in hygiene, assembly, and logistics carried those skills into the growing reconstruction industry. By 1950, Coca-Cola was no longer an exotic foreign product. It had become part of Japan's new identity, a sign of recovery and participation in the global marketplace. In advertisements published after the Allied occupation, smiling Japanese youth posed with the same glass bottles once handed out behind POW fences. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a prisoner's surprise had become a nation's symbol of rebirth. The American government recognized this shift. Food aid and private enterprise intertwined, teaching a new lesson in influence. Where military conquest ends, economic presence begins. Coca-Cola had moved faster than any treaty, a fluid ambassador of the post-war order. The Japanese, pragmatic and industrious, adapted quickly. They respected efficiency, admired cleanliness, and understood symbols. Soon, American-style vending stalls appeared near train stations. Coffee replaced rationed barley tea. The Coca-Cola red disc became as familiar as the rising sun. In this quiet evolution, one could trace the blueprint of the new alliance forming between former enemies, an alliance sealed not by signatures or ceremonies, but by shared habits. The war had proven what destruction could achieve. Now, the peace would prove what taste could rebuild. And that rebuilding would reach its most symbolic moment in the camps themselves, the day when prisoners, once loyal to the emperor, lifted bottles in their hands and confronted the full meaning of what America had brought. The camp lay on the edge of Yokohama, a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by a double line of barbed wire. Beyond it stretched a city reduced to ashes, the harbor filled with wrecks and the distant silhouettes of American ships unloading supplies. It was the first week of September 1945. The sky hung low with gray clouds, and the air smelled faintly of salt and diesel. Inside the camp, hundreds of Japanese prisoners moved slowly, sweeping the ground, repairing fences, cleaning latrines. Their faces were gaunt, their uniforms little more than rags. Yet order prevailed, a discipline that had survived even defeat. That morning, the guards seemed strangely cheerful. The sound of trucks approached, heavier, louder than the usual food deliveries. Dust rose along the dirt road as two olive-drab vehicles rolled in, escorted by a jeep. On their wooden sides, stenciled in red, was a logo that most prisoners could not read, but instantly recognized after weeks of curiosity. Coca-Cola Company, U.S. Army Supply. The trucks halted inside the perimeter. American soldiers jumped down, their boots crunching gravel. They began unloading crates, heavy, carefully stacked boxes filled with glass bottles. The sun, breaking through the clouds for the first time that day, flashed against the glass. The prisoners gathered in quiet lines. No one spoke. A few whispered that it was medicine, or perhaps some chemical for the guards. Others guessed it was beer. A rumor spread from nearby docks. Then came the sound, clink, hiss, fizz. An American sergeant, sleeves rolled up, opened a bottle with a field opener and raised it to his lips. The sharp crack of carbonation echoed across the camp. He drank, smiled faintly, then called for an interpreter. "Tell them," he said. "This is for them, too." At first, the words were met with disbelief. A few prisoners stepped forward, hesitated, then accepted the bottles. The glass felt impossibly cold, beads of condensation sliding down the sides. They bowed instinctively before taking a sip. The reaction was immediate. Eyes widened. Some coughed from the fizz. Others laughed. A short, startled laugh that startled even themselves. A few men held the bottle away, watching the bubbles rise as if it were alive. One young corporal closed his eyes and drank slowly, his lips trembling. He later told an interpreter, "It tastes like something from another world." The Americans continued passing bottles along the rows. Within minutes, the camp, once silent and grim, filled with the soft clinking of glass and the faint music of conversation. The soldiers stood nearby, leaning on rifles, smiling as they watched their former enemies rediscover something human. For the prisoners, it was more than a drink. It was proof that mercy existed. The empire had fallen. Their weapons were gone. Yet here was the victor, offering not punishment, but kindness in the form of a drink that symbolized everything Japan had lost. Industry, comfort, confidence. A few men began to cry quietly. One elderly officer who had commanded troops in Burma raised his bottle in silent salute to the Americans. The gesture was simple, but carried the weight of generations. Acknowledgement without surrender, respect without words. For the guards, too, the scene was not without meaning. They had fought long, lost friends, endured horrors. To stand here now, sharing soda with the enemy, felt strange, but somehow right. A corporal from Kansas wrote in his journal that night, "We gave the Japs Coke today. Some cried, some smiled. I don't think any of us will forget that sound. Bottles hissing open in a place that had seen so much hate. That moment, recorded in diaries and later remembered by occupation staff, became a quiet symbol of what the war had turned into. Not just the end of fighting, but the beginning of understanding. Under the humid sky of a defeated empire, the fizz of 1,000 bottles marked a turning point far greater than anyone could name. It was not victory paraded through Tokyo. It was the sound of peace beginning, one bottle at a time. And as the last crate emptied, as the men sat quietly drinking side by side, another realization began to settle. This gesture was not temporary. It was a glimpse of what the world would soon become. A world where power spoke not only through might, but through generosity. The memory of that day would follow many of those prisoners long after they returned home. For some, it was their first encounter with the taste of America. For others, it was their first understanding that defeat could also carry grace. But the symbolism didn't end in the camp. Beyond those fences, the same red-stamped crates were beginning to appear across the ruins of Tokyo and Osaka. And soon, Coca-Cola would cease to be a gift from conquerors and become part of a nation's rebirth. By the second week of September 1945, scenes like the one at Yokohama repeated themselves across Japan. In Nagasaki, in Sendai, in the ruins of Osaka, wherever American occupation units established command posts, bottles began to appear. Some came directly from military supply depots, others from hastily reassembled bottling lines using syrup shipped from Guam or Hawaii. The red disc of the Coca-Cola logo became one of the first foreign emblems to appear in post-war Japan. Children pointed to it with curiosity. Adults, still wary, observed from a distance as Americans unloaded crates at the edge of camps and docks. A few brave civilians approached, asking what it was. Soldiers answered not with words, but with gestures. A bottle offered, a smile, a nod. Each exchange was a kind of diplomacy, improvised but powerful. To those who had known nothing but scarcity, the drink was almost ceremonial. For many Japanese, it was the first taste of sweetness since before the war. They drank slowly, savoring it, as if afraid the moment would vanish. American officers noticed something remarkable. The hostility that once lingered between captor and captive began to soften. The Japanese prisoners worked more willingly. Civilians who had refused to speak began to assist in reconstruction tasks. Even the local guards, Japanese police under Allied command, seemed to relax. It wasn't the sugar or the caffeine that changed them. It was the gesture, the humanity behind it. In a war defined by brutality, the smallest act of generosity carried disproportionate weight. The simple offer of a bottle communicated what propaganda never could: that Americans, for all their might, were not conquerors seeking humiliation, but victors intent on rebuilding. Across the Pacific, the company's Atlanta headquarters received reports from field officers describing how Coca-Cola had become a symbol of goodwill. Army photographers captured images of soldiers sharing drinks with locals, and these photos soon appeared in American newspapers. They told a new story, not of conquest, but of coexistence. For the Japanese, those images, too, began to circulate. U.S. occupation forces established newspapers and radio programs that featured glimpses of American life. Families at picnics, soldiers drinking soda beside jeeps, smiling freely. After years of propaganda portraying Americans as monsters, these scenes were quietly revolutionary. But the most striking transformation occurred in the minds of those who had once fought hardest. In camp journals recovered decades later, former imperial officers reflected on the Coca-Cola incident with surprising emotion. One wrote, "When I drank that bottle, I realized we had lost not only the war, but the world we thought we understood. The Americans did not conquer with cruelty. They conquered with comfort. Another noted simply, "They gave us sweetness when we expected punishment. That was more powerful than any weapon." These confessions, once private, later became symbolic of Japan's psychological reconstruction. A shift from militarism to admiration, from suspicion to curiosity. The bottle had done what politics could not. It bridged the distance between enemy and human being. American intelligence officers studying civilian morale took note. Psychological reports from 1946 concluded that gestures of generosity, especially involving food and drink, had a measurable impact on compliance and cooperation. In short, kindness was strategic. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola's role in the Pacific expanded under formal military coordination. The U.S. Navy authorized new bottling plants in Yokohama and Fukuoka, staffed largely by local labor. Every bottle produced required glass recycling, creating a small but vital post-war industry. Within months, Japanese workers learned American hygiene standards, bottling procedures, and maintenance routines. Without realizing it, they were learning the first steps of post-war industrial recovery. The sound of bottling machines, rhythmic, metallic, steady, became the pulse of reconstruction. In a country where factories had once produced shells and rifles, they now produced refreshment. To the occupying Americans, this was simply efficiency. To the Japanese, it was something close to hope. The hiss of carbonation, the clink of bottles, these became sounds of a new era, faint but unmistakable. By early 1946, Coca-Cola was appearing in Tokyo's black markets, sold not as contraband but as treasure. A single bottle could fetch the equivalent of a week's pay. The company took note, and so did the military. Soon, controlled civilian distribution began. An early signal that occupation had entered its second phase. Normalization, the same product that had traveled with bombers and infantry, now traveled with peacekeepers and engineers. The same bottle that had symbolized victory now symbolized partnership. And yet, for those who had first tasted it behind wire fences, the memory carried something sacred. Many former prisoners, when interviewed decades later, described that day. The trucks, the bottles, the American smiles, with perfect clarity. Some kept the bottle caps as mementos. Others told their grandchildren this was the taste of peace. It was not exaggeration. For a generation raised on sacrifice and obedience, the experience of being offered something unnecessary yet kind was transformative. It represented a new world, one where power came not from fear, but from generosity. The bottles, once emptied, were stacked neatly near the barracks. The Americans collected them later, washed, and refilled them. But in the minds of those who had held them, something irreversible had changed. The world had tilted on its axis. The victors had redefined victory itself, not as domination, but as the ability to give freely. And from that moment on, the occupation of Japan would no longer be remembered only for its armies, but for its gestures. For the first bottle of Coca-Cola shared between enemies who no longer were. The months following the surrender transformed Japan in ways no treaty could have predicted. The occupation was not merely a military command, it was a cultural intervention. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo, known as GHQ, became the center of a quiet revolution. One waged not through weapons, but through ideas, habits, and symbols. Among those symbols, Coca-Cola occupied a curious place. It was not listed in the official policies of demilitarization or democratization, yet its presence was everywhere. Cases of the drink arrived alongside reconstruction materials. Bottling plants sprang up near U.S. bases, providing jobs to civilians and a steady supply for occupation forces. At first, the Japanese government treated it as a novelty. But within a year, economists began noting its unexpected influence. Each crate required glass, sugar, and transportation. industries that had been crippled by bombing but could now restart under American contracts. The infrastructure of comfort, it turned out, was also an infrastructure of recovery. In Tokyo's streets, children began to recognize the red and white logo. Photographs from 1946 show groups of them crowding around American soldiers holding bottles, their expressions a mix of curiosity and joy. In Osaka, Japanese factory workers were rewarded with soft drinks after long shifts rebuilding railways. The sight of Americans and Japanese sharing the same beverage blurred the edges of hierarchy. The U.S. administration saw opportunity in this subtle transformation. Reports from the Civil, Information and Education section noted that every friendly contact between U.S. personnel and Japanese civilians diminishes fear and fosters trust. The same reports listed small comforts, cigarettes, coffee, candy, and cola as essential morale bridges. Coca-Cola's distribution became part of the psychological reconstruction strategy. Soldiers were instructed to share their rations with locals when possible, especially children and laborers. For a generation that had grown up associating the West with bombers, such acts carried immense weight. The gift of a drink did not erase memory, but it replaced fear with familiarity. Meanwhile, American companies watched closely. The war had ended, but global markets were opening. Japan, with its skilled workforce and hunger for modern goods, became a proving ground for new forms of commerce. The Coca-Cola Company, working quietly through military channels, began planning for long-term production. By 1947, licensing agreements were under discussion, laying the foundation for local bottling under Japanese management. Culturally, the drink's presence began to shape something larger than appetite. It represented the rhythm of everyday life that Americans brought with them, the habit of refreshment, the ritual of pause. For people emerging from years of scarcity, this rhythm was mesmerizing. It suggested not carelessness, but control, the ability to enjoy abundance without shame. In the years that followed, American soldiers often described Japan as the most cooperative occupied nation in history. Part of that cooperation came from necessity, but part of it came from transformation, a slow, almost invisible shift in perception. The occupiers no longer seemed like faceless conquerors. They were the people who built roads, handed out chocolate, and shared bottles that hissed and bubbled like laughter. Coca-Cola had become a soft weapon, a tool of diplomacy disguised as a drink. It carried the message of a new global order, that freedom, comfort, and modernity were intertwined. And as Japan began to rebuild its cities, its industries, and its spirit, that message would seep into every corner of its rebirth, from its factories to its festivals, from the hum of machines to the chatter of markets. The war had ended with silence, but the peace began with a sound far gentler, the opening of a bottle. The opening of a bottle. By 1947, the sound of clinking glass had become part of Japan's Reconstruction soundtrack. In cities that had once burned, American jeeps now rolled past new street markets and makeshift shops. The war-scarred population learned to live under the strange duality of ruin and renewal. And in that daily rhythm, Coca-Cola remained, a small, familiar comfort in a landscape still haunted by memory. At the bottling plant in Yokohama, Japanese workers reported for duty wearing patched uniforms, now replaced with company aprons. They learned to operate U.S.-made machines that filled, capped, and labeled bottles at astonishing speed. The process was meticulous. Every bottle washed 3 times, every cap inspected. Precision replaced desperation. Order replaced scarcity. For many of those workers, the factory was their first experience of post-war stability. Economic recovery was beginning to take shape. U.S. aid flowed through the Marshall Plan in Europe and through direct occupation spending in Japan. American dollars rebuilt factories, reopened ports, and stabilized the yen. Coca-Cola's quiet expansion mirrored this trajectory. It followed wherever U.S. influence restored trade. In that sense, every bottle carried not only sugar and carbonation, but the promise of integration into a new global system, one dominated by production, efficiency, and consumer culture. To the average Japanese citizen, the symbolism was subtle but powerful. The same forces that had once brought war now brought modern life. Roads, telephones, refrigerators, and advertising all arrived under American guidance. And at the center of this transformation stood the unmistakable red disc of Coca-Cola. By 1948, advertisements in local papers began to appear. They were modest at first, a single bottle, the slogan translated into simple Japanese, refreshing life. The images showed smiling men and women in Western clothes, their postures relaxed, their faces at ease. To a nation emerging from militarism and hardship, these images carried quiet seduction. Peace looked like this. Soon, Coca-Cola was no longer limited to occupation forces. Civilians could buy it at select kiosks and canteens. School children traded empty bottles for marbles. Small shops displayed hand-painted signs reading Coca-Cola, written in phonetic katakana. A foreign word, but no longer a foreign feeling. In American policy circles, this transformation was noted with satisfaction. The occupation's success, MacArthur wrote, depended on winning the Japanese heart. While reforms in education, land, and governance were vital, it was the daily interactions, the acts of generosity and routine, that reshaped identity. A cold drink on a hot afternoon could do what political decrees could not: make peace tangible. By 1950, the U.S. military's role began to shift as Japan took its first steps toward sovereignty. The Korean War soon turned the islands into a logistical hub, reviving industry overnight. Coca-Cola bottling plants expanded again, this time under joint management. The drink that once symbolized defeat now symbolized participation. Japan was no longer a subject of occupation, but a partner in production. Former prisoners of war, now free citizens, sometimes worked alongside American technicians who had once guarded them. In memoirs written decades later, several recalled the memory of that first Coca-Cola in 1945. One wrote, "It was not the sweetness I remembered. It was the kindness. That bottle told us the world could begin again." That sentiment, echoed across generations, defined the post-war alliance more profoundly than any treaty. The United States had discovered that influence could flow through culture as powerfully as through policy. And Japan had discovered that defeat could become transformation. By the mid-1950s, Coca-Cola was being bottled entirely by Japanese companies, marketed to a growing middle class that had made peace with modernity. The same drink that once crossed barbed wire fences now sat on family tables, served in cafes, advertised beside Mount Fuji. What began as an act of mercy had become a mirror of the new world, where former enemies built prosperity together, and the language of friendship could be spoken in the fizz of a bottle. The war had rewritten borders, but a single shared drink had rewritten hearts. History often remembers wars by their battles: the thunder of artillery, the fall of cities, the signatures on surrender papers. But sometimes, peace begins not with words or weapons, but with something far smaller: a shared gesture, a moment that restores dignity to those who have lost everything. For Japan and the United States, that gesture came in the shape of a glass bottle. Coca-Cola, a product of American factories and optimism, arrived in a land of ruins as quietly as the dawn. It was not part of any treaty. It carried no flag, no command. Yet it did something extraordinary. It bridged the unbridgeable. To the Americans, it was the taste of home, a comfort they had carried through jungles and battlefields. To the Japanese, it was the taste of something they had never known: sweetness without guilt, abundance without arrogance, generosity without demand. That first sip behind the fences of Yokohama did not erase the pain of war. It did not restore the dead or rebuild the cities overnight, but it changed perception. The way enemies saw each other, the way the defeated understood victory. In its fizz and sweetness, it carried a quiet message that even after total destruction, life could begin again. Over the years, Coca-Cola became woven into Japan's post-war identity. No longer foreign, but familiar. No longer a symbol of defeat, but of renewal. It became part of everyday life, a simple joy that survived the scars of history. And perhaps that is the real lesson of 1945. That power is not only measured in armies or bombs, but in the capacity to rebuild trust, one ordinary act at a time. The bottle that once passed through barbed wire now sits in museums and memories, its glass long emptied but its meaning preserved. It reminds us that victory, when tempered by humanity, can create not humiliation, but hope. In the end, the war's loudest echoes faded. What remained was quieter. The hiss of a bottle opening, the taste of peace shared between former enemies, and the realization that kindness, too, can conquer the world.